Hi, and welcome back to the second version of the third episode of Just the Facts, Ma'am. The second version because I uploaded a talk on tariffs, today's topic, 2 days ago, but as I watched that back and thought about it, it was pretty clear that I needed to redo it. So anyone who watched that and is watching this, I appreciate you and your dedication. Okay, so jumping right into it. Tariffs have gotten a lot of talk and press lately. And so it's a really good example of why I started this channel, because it's pretty clear that we all will benefit from up-to-date, accurate, and straightforward explanation of topics in the government and current events. So I hope to be able to do that here for you tonight. All right, so what is a tariff? It is a tax that a government imposes on the import or export of goods. In the US, it's only import because export taxes are prohibited in the Constitution under the aptly named Export Clause. So American tariffs are only import tariffs. And that's true with most countries. When you hear about tariffs, most of the time they're talking about imports. There are a couple of examples of export tariffs. China has a few, but those are really pretty uncommon. And then there are different types of tariffs. Specific, compounded, rate quota, but the ones that you hear about the most and the ones that have been in the news lately are called ad valorem. And that is Latin for according to the value. And that means that the tax is calculated as a percentage of the value of the goods. So for example, if the recently proposed 25% tariff on all goods from Mexico were to get enacted and enforced, car manufacturing, which there's a lot of in Mexico, would be affected. Cars being imported to the US would be stopped at the border, and customs would look at the value of the goods. And let's say, for easy math, the car was $40,000. 25% of that is $10,000. So the company would pay that. It'd be collected by the Custom and Border Patrol. That money would be forwarded to the general fund, which falls under the US Treasury because it's revenue for the federal government. And it's the company that's paying those taxes. So if it's a Toyota, Toyota pays, not Japan. If it's a VW, VW pays, not Germany. If it's a Ford or a Chevy, those companies pay, not the US. If it's a Kia, Kia pays, not South Korea. So the point I'm really trying to drive home here is it's the company doing the importing. And in case there's any confusion, it's not just American companies that can import into the US. Most companies that import into the US are American. So it is true that American tariffs affect American companies the greatest. So we know what a tax is, we know who pays it, we know the mechanism of the collection. So the next thing I want to talk about is what happens next. Well, you can imagine companies don't just sort of sit down and take it when their cost is raised. They have to make an adjustment. Typically, and most often what happens is they just pass along that increase to the consumer. It's called price pass-through. If, however, they don't think that's going to be successful, the market's flooded, or they've already maxed out their prices and they don't think that consumers will buy at raised prices, or for whatever reason they don't think that's going to work, then they do have to absorb that hit in the profit, and it stymies their growth as a business. They can't hire new workers, they can't increase wages. If it's bad enough, they have to let workers go. Or they can do other things, try to find different sources of those goods in different countries. But the idea that tariffs protect domestic companies, that is where it can get really confusing, because in some cases it's true. And an example of that is tariffs have been used since there's been emerging economies, from the Middle Ages. And the same is true in the United States from 1776 to the early 20th century, when state and federal income taxes were imposed. Tariffs were a primary source of revenue for the government. And so let's say in 1850, there's a family from Switzerland who moved over, and they come from a long line of clockmakers. And so now this Swiss-American family is making clocks, and we'll say that the going price in 1850 is $10. And their cousin back in Switzerland is making the same type of clocks, but with an import tariff. it costs more, right? So you have either a clock that's $10 or you have one that's $12. And in that example, it's very obvious. Yeah, of course, we're going to all buy the domestic product because it's less expensive, and our patriotism is strong and we want to support that emerging business. But if it gets more complicated than that, which largely it does, especially with technology and how interwoven trade is and supply chain, then it gets to be tricky. And there is a really interesting, it talks about just a simple electronic component in the in cars, in car seats, not baby safety seats, but just car seats that move. A capacitor comes in from China, gets sent down comes into Colorado, that gets bought by a Michigan company, gets sent down to Mexico, or gets put into a circuit board, has to come back into Texas for some sort of import compliance check, gets sent back to a different manufacturing site in Mexico where they turn it into an actuator, which is the little thing that actually makes the car seat move. Those actuators get sent up to either a plant in Texas or one in Ontario to car seat manufacturers. Those car seats that get sent to wherever the car is then getting finalized, oftentimes in Mexico. So if you can picture how many times those little components are going back and forth across the borders, potentially running into tariffs and cost increases that have to get passed along somewhere, you can see how tariffs become confusing and complicated and expensive. So really what comes next is how the company can flex and how it can adapt to absorbing or passing along that cost. That's at the company level. Governments can also try to flex or make changes. And we see examples of that recently. Last year, President Biden imposed a 100% tariff on electronic vehicles from China. And this really, crippled that import. He did that for security and safety reasons. He thought that the American market would get flooded with presumably unsafe vehicles. And then very recently, President Trump threatened the tariffs on Mexico and Canada until they tighten up their border security in terms of illegal immigration and fentanyl. And the governments of those countries made some changes. And so right now those tariffs are on pause. So there's company level adaptations and changes, and then there's government level. If one of the flexes that they do turns out to be retaliatory tariffs, then, that means that other countries are imposing tariffs, and generally what that equates to in the most simplest terms is prices of everything go up everywhere. And I will leave you there, but with 3 recommended readings, which are asterisked in the Google document below. One is a much better explanation of all this than I can do, written by the Economic Policy Institute, and the title is something like Tariffs, Everything That You Want to Know But We're Afraid to Ask. So look through that. The second recommended reading is the Atlantic Charter. That's an agreement between Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt in August of 1941. World War II was going on. The U.S. wasn't involved in it yet, but these were 8 principles that these 2 heads of state had laid out to try to be a roadmap of how to sort of conduct business, not only during the war, but post-war, with the idea that these principles would lead toward increased peace and stability. And what's interesting about that, and why I'm bringing it up in this talk, is it's inextricably linked to trade security. So national and international peace and security and trade security go together. So that's worth reading about, and also just really interesting. And then the last thing is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. And so that talks more about the effect of perhaps good intentioned tariffs or with specific intentions, but when retaliatory tariffs get put into place, what happens? And I will leave you with this clip to explain it further. I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you next month.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the, anyone? The Great Depression, passed the, anyone? The tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which, anyone, raised or lowered raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression.